My name is Naomi. I'm in my mid 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, not loud, not dramatic. The one who shows up on time, pays her share early, remembers birthdays without needing reminders. I work in a practical field, the kind that rewards accuracy and patience more than charisma. If you met me at a family gathering, you might remember me as the quiet one in the corner, helping in the kitchen while everyone else talked in the living room. People have always assumed that because I'm calm, I'm flexible. That's because I don't argue, I don't notice. If I don't raise my voice, I must not have a limit. I've learned that underestimation often wears the costume of politeness. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about winning an argument or humiliating anyone. It's about something much quieter than that. About realization, boundaries, and what happens when someone you thought would always be there decides, without asking, that you don't really count. When our parents passed away, I believed grief would be the hardest part. I was wrong. Grief was heavy, yes, but it was honest. What came after was something else entirely. Administrative decisions made too quickly, assumptions made too casually, and a kind of entitlement that revealed itself only when it was already in motion. I'm telling this story because it unfolded in a way that surprised even me, not because of dramatic twists, but because of how little noise it required. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no public scenes, just paperwork, silence, and timing. You'll hear about a house that was sold too soon, about a funeral that hadn't even had time to settle into memory, about a morning when I arrived, expecting to collect photographs, and found movers loading furniture I had paid for, treating me like an inconvenience rather than a stakeholder. You'll hear about how easy it is for people to decide what belongs to them when they believe you won't challenge it. But more importantly, this is a story about what happens internally when you stop explaining yourself. When you realize that fairness doesn't come from being understood, but from being precise. When silence stops being something you endure and becomes something you choose. I won't exaggerate. I won't dramatize conversations or turn people into villains. Everyone in the story believed they were being reasonable. That's part of what makes it worth telling. Because the most damaging decisions are often made calmly, with a smile, under the assumption that no one will object. If you're listening because you've ever been the reliable one, the sibling who didn't make waves, the person whose contribution was noticed only when it was missing, then you'll probably recognize parts of yourself here. I'm not sharing this to ask for sympathy. I'm sharing it because clarity came late, but when it arrived, it stayed. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized someone crossed your line only after they were already far past it? In my family, I was the one who filled gaps, not in a heroic way, not in a way anyone thanked me for. I filled the quiet spaces, the ones between decisions, between arguments, between people who were louder and more certain than I was. If something needed to be handled and no one else volunteered, it usually ended up with me. If there was confusion, I clarified it. If there was a mess, I cleaned it. And if there was silence, I stayed in it. My older brother, Daniel, was always described as decisive. He spoke quickly, confidently, and with the kind of certainty that makes people assume competence. When he made suggestions, they sounded like conclusions. When I made them, they sounded like options. That difference mattered more than anyone admitted. At family gatherings, Daniel took up space without trying. Stories paused when he spoke. Opinions adjusted themselves around his. I learned early that if I wanted to be heard, I needed to make my words efficient, short, useful, unchallenging. Over time, I stopped trying to compete for attention at all. I focused on being accurate instead. I paid bills on time. I organized documents. I kept copies. When our parents began to struggle with health issues, I was the one who scheduled appointments, followed up with insurance, and made sure medications were refilled. Daniel handled the big picture, or at least that's how it was described. I handled the details that actually made things work. No one called it a division of labor. It just happened. When our parents passed away, first our mother, then our father, not long after, the roles didn't change. They hardened. Grief rearranged everything, but it didn't erase habits. Daniel spoke for the family. I supported from the side. He discussed plans. I made sure the numbers added up. People often confuse quietness with agreement. I didn't correct them. At the funeral, relatives approached me with sympathetic smiles and said things like, "You're so strong," or "You're holding it together so well." What they meant was that I wasn't making anyone uncomfortable. I wasn't crying loudly. I wasn't asking for anything. Strength in that context meant convenience. Daniel accepted condolences like a representative. He talked about next steps, about handling things, about making sure everything was taken care of. People nodded, relieved that someone sounded in control. I stood nearby, listening, noticing which details were being skipped over, which assumptions were forming without resistance. I noticed a lot. In the weeks after the funeral, friends checked in on Daniel to see how he was managing everything. They checked in on me to ask if I was helping him. No one asked how I was managing. No one asked what I wanted to do with the things that mattered to me. It wasn't malicious. That's important to say. No one sat down and decided I didn't count. It was subtler than that. It was the natural outcome of years of being reliable without being visible. I had always been the one who paid early, who covered shortfalls, who didn't chase credit. When furniture needed replacing in our parents' house years earlier, I paid for it because I had the cash and it seemed practical. I didn't label it as leverage. I labeled it as a responsibility. Responsibility, I would learn, is often mistaken for permission. When conversations happened about the house, they happened quickly, casually, usually between Daniel and someone else. I was informed, not consulted. "We're thinking of doing this," he'd say, or "It probably makes sense to handle it this way." I nodded, asked clarifying questions, and took mental notes. From the outside, I looked agreeable. From the inside, I was cataloging patterns. I knew who I was to them. I was the reasonable one, the backup, the safety net, the person who wouldn't complicate things by having strong feelings at inconvenient times. What they never considered was that my quiet wasn't emptiness. It was attention. And attention, when sustained long enough, becomes memory, becomes evidence, becomes something very different from passivity. At that point in the story, though, none of that was visible yet. To them, I was still just Naomi, the helpful sister, the calm presence, the one who would understand. And for a while, I let them keep believing that. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no sharp comment that everyone felt silent over. That's why it took me a while to name it for what it was. It happened about a week after the funeral. Daniel called me in the late afternoon, his voice brisk in the way it gets when he's already made a decision and is simply informing someone else. He said he'd spoken to a real estate agent earlier that day, a friend of a friend, very capable, very efficient. He said the agent thought it would be smart to move quickly while the market was still favorable. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, watching the light shift on the counter as the sun lowered. I asked carefully what move quickly meant. Well, he said, list the house. Maybe even accept an early offer if it's clean. I paused, not because I disagreed, but because something in the phrasing felt premature. Our father had been gone less than 10 days. The house still smelled like him. His jacket was still hanging by the door. I said, I thought we'd take some time to go through things. There was a beat of silence, not reflective silence, calculating silence. Yeah, Daniel replied, but we can't just sit on it. There are costs, taxes, maintenance. It makes more sense to be practical. Practical. That word again. It was always practical when it aligned with his timeline. I said I understood the financial logic. I asked gently if we could at least agree on a window. Some time for me to collect personal items, documents, and photographs. Things that weren't about value, but about memory. Of course, he said quickly. We're not animals. He laughed lightly, as if I'd made a strange joke. Then he added, I'll handle the logistics. Less stress for you. That was the cut, not the decision itself. The assumption inside it. The idea that handling things was his role, and that my role was to be spared the burden of involvement. As if participation were a weight rather than a right. I didn't argue. I thanked him for keeping me in the loop. I told myself I was being sensitive because of grief. I told myself this was just how Daniel communicated. Direct, efficient. I told myself there would be time. Later that evening, I received an email forwarded from the agent. It outlined a proposed timeline, professional photos, a preliminary walkthrough, minor staging adjustments. Staging adjustments. I read the list twice before it registered that the furniture mentioned wasn't Daniel's, or the agent's, or even our parents', in the way people usually mean ownership. It was mine, the dining table I had bought when the old one cracked, the sofa I'd paid for when our mother's mobility declined and she needed something firmer, the guest bed I'd ordered and assembled myself when Dad started sleeping downstairs. I had never drawn up contracts or made declarations. I had simply paid because it was easier than debating, because it helped, because it seemed obvious at the time. The email referred to these items as included contents. I replied calmly, asking for clarification. I wrote that some of the furniture belonged to me, purchased with my own funds, and that I would be removing it before any sale. The response came from Daniel, not the agent. Let's not get into itemizing right now, he wrote. It's not productive. We can sort that out later. Later, another soft dismissal wrapped in reasonableness. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Not because I was confused, but because something in me was recalibrating. A quiet internal note is being made. This is how it starts. No one else saw a problem. When I mentioned it to an aunt, she waved it off. He's just trying to keep things moving, she said. You know how he is. I did know how he was. What I didn't know yet was how far that momentum would carry him once he stopped checking whether I was still standing in the way. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't even sting at first, but it marked a boundary that had been crossed without ceremony. And once crossed, it was never really acknowledged again. I remembered it anyway. After that first exchange, nothing exploded. That was the unsettling part. Life didn't fracture into obvious sides. Instead, it continued almost smoothly, as if the small disregard I'd felt had been absorbed into the routine of getting things done. That's how disrespect becomes normal. Not through cruelty, but through momentum. Daniel kept moving. Phone calls with agents, emails with subject lines that implied progress. Update. Next steps. Quick question. Each one carried decisions already half made. I was copied, not centered, informed, not involved. When I responded, I did so carefully. I asked for clarification, not control. I chose neutral language. I told myself this was strategic, that pushing back too early would only make things harder. I was still grieving. We all were. I didn't want conflict to become the story. So I adapted. I noticed that when I asked questions verbally, Daniel answered vaguely. When I asked them in writing, he delayed. When I pressed gently, he reframed. Let's not complicate this. We're on the same side. We can talk about that later. Later became a kind of horizon that kept receding. One afternoon, I stopped by the house alone. I hadn't told Daniel. I didn't need to. I just wanted to sit for a while. The rooms were quieter than I remembered, already stripped of some of their warmth. I opened drawers. I found empty spaces where things used to be. A box of papers on the kitchen counter caught my attention. Real estate disclosures, preliminary inventory lists, sticky notes with shorthand I didn't recognize. It wasn't secrecy exactly, it was a presumption. The idea that I didn't need to be asked. That if I had concerns, I would raise them loudly enough to matter. Since I hadn't, the path forward was clear. I picked up my father's old photo albums from the hallway shelf and held them for a long time. That shelf hadn't been mentioned in any list. It wasn't valuable. It was just there. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of urgency. Not panic, awareness. I began to understand that my silence wasn't being read as patience. It was being read as consent. At home that night, I opened my laptop and went through my records. Bank statements, receipts, emails from years back. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for grounding, proof of my own memory. There was a strange comfort in the clarity of numbers, dates, amounts, a paper trail that didn't argue or reinterpret itself. Still, I didn't confront Daniel. I told myself there would be a right moment, a calmer moment. I told myself that once the dust settled, we'd talk like adults. In the meantime, the language around me kept shifting. The house became the asset. The contents became the package. Our parents' lives became the estate. Grief was translated into spreadsheets. And I understood the necessity of that intellectually. But emotionally, something felt off. I started hearing phrases like, "You don't need to worry about that," and "I've got it covered," and "Trust me." Trust, in this context, meant stepping back. When I did try to assert small boundaries, mentioning again that I would need time to collect my belongings, I was met with reassurance that sounded generous but wasn't binding. Of course, Daniel would say, we'll make it work. Work around whom? Around what? The normalization was subtle. Each time I let a moment pass without pressing, it became easier for the next one to pass too. I wasn't being pushed, I was being edged out. And I participated in it. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I rationalized my own erasure because it felt kinder than conflict. I told myself that being flexible was a virtue, that grief made everyone clumsy, that my brother wasn't malicious, just focused. All of that was true. And still, it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had been assigned a familiar role, and I was slipping into it without resistance. The role of the one who adjusts, the one who doesn't insist, the one who will be fine. I could feel a quiet tension building, not anger, but something more alert. A sense that if I didn't recalibrate soon, the story would solidify around me in a way that left very little room to move. But at that point, I still believed I could resolve it by being reasonable. I still believed that if I waited, if I stayed calm, if I chose the right words at the right time, everything would even out. That belief kept me quiet longer than it should have. And it taught everyone else that quiet was my natural state. It wasn't a single conversation that made the pattern clear. It was the accumulation of them. The way decisions were narrated to me as conclusions. The way my input was welcomed only after it no longer mattered. I began to see the role I'd been placed in with uncomfortable clarity. I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't even the co-decision maker. I was the stabilizer. The person whose job was to absorb inconvenience so that others could move faster. My value was measured not by my stake, but by my smoothness. When I asked questions that slowed things down, they were met with reassurance instead of answers. When I expressed preferences, they were treated as emotional reactions rather than legitimate considerations. And when I stayed quiet, my silence was taken as confirmation that everything was fine. Daniel didn't say any of this outright. He didn't need to. The system worked because everyone played their part without naming it. I started noticing how often I was thanked for being understanding. Understanding of what exactly? That things happening without me? That my needs were secondary to efficiency. One afternoon, Daniel called to let me know he'd scheduled professional staging. He said it casually, like it was a detail not worth dwelling on. They'll just rearrange things a bit, he said. Make it more neutral. Neutral meant emptied of personal history. I asked when this would happen. He gave me a date I hadn't agreed to, a date that conflicted with my schedule. Well, he said, after I pointed that out, it's hard to coordinate everyone. I assumed you'd be flexible. There it was, not a request, an assumption. I realized then that my flexibility had become an expectation. And expectations, once set, are rarely questioned by the people who benefit from them. In family conversations, Daniel spoke in plurals. We've decided. We think it's best. We're moving forward. I was technically included in that we, but functionally absent from it. My presence was symbolic. My consent is implied. I began to feel like a guest in a process that directly affected me. What unsettled me most wasn't the logistics. It was the way my emotional proximity to the house, to the objects inside it, was treated as an inconvenience, as something to be managed rather than respected. I thought about all the times in the past when I had stepped in without being asked, when I'd covered expenses quietly, when I'd taken care of the details so others didn't have to. None of that was being remembered as a contribution. It was being remembered as baseline behavior. Once, during a brief moment of honesty, I said, I feel a little rushed. Daniel sighed, not heavily, just enough to register impatience. We can't drag this out, he said. Everyone's dealing with something. We just have to get through it. Get through it. As if the goal were to finish, not to be fair. That was when it clicked. The role I was expected to play wasn't temporary. It wasn't grief related. It was structural. I was the one who would adjust so that others didn't have to. And I had helped build that structure over years of being dependable without being firm. I didn't feel angry. I felt sober. I stopped trying to be persuasive. I stopped explaining my feelings in detail. I noticed that the more I explained, the more my concerns were treated as negotiable. So I pulled back, not outwardly, but internally. I began observing instead of participating, listening for what was said and what wasn't, watching how timelines were framed, noting who benefited from urgency and who bore its cost. I didn't announce this shift. There was no declaration, just a quiet recognition that the role assigned to me no longer matched the position I needed to occupy. I was still reliable, still calm, still helpful on the surface. But something fundamental had changed. I no longer believed that being invisible would protect me. And once that belief dissolved, everything that followed began to reorganize itself around a different center, one that didn't require permission to exist. The shift didn't happen during a conversation. There was no argument that tipped the balance, no revelation delivered in a dramatic way. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that usually passes without being remembered. I drove to the house alone. I hadn't planned it carefully. I just woke up with the sense that if I didn't go that day, something would be lost. Not physically yet, but internally. A connection, maybe, or clarity. The street was quiet when I arrived. The house looked unchanged from the outside, still holding its shape, still pretending nothing inside was in transition. I unlocked the door with the key I'd never returned, even after being asked if Daniel should handle all that. Inside, the air felt different. Not empty exactly, but unsettled, as if the rooms had already begun bracing for strangers. I walked through slowly, touching familiar surfaces. The banister was worn smooth by decades of hands. The small crack in the wall near the hallway that my father had promised to fix one day. The kitchen table, my table, is now bare except for a staging brochure left behind. I sat down in the living room and let the quiet settle. That was when I noticed the missing box. It had been tucked under the side table, out of sight unless you knew to look for it. A plain cardboard box, unmarked. Inside were letters, old ones. Notes my parents had written to each other before I was born. Cards from anniversaries. A few handwritten recipes in my mother's careful script. I had placed it there myself after the funeral, intending to take it home once things slowed down. The box was gone. I searched calmly at first, checking the closet, the back room, the garage. It wasn't there. In its place was an emptiness that felt deliberate, even if it wasn't malicious. Someone had decided to organize. I sat back down, not panicked, not angry, just very still. In that moment, something precise aligned inside me. Not outrage, understanding. Understood that the process moving forward was not designed to protect what mattered to me. It was designed to move efficiently, and anything that didn't announce its value loudly enough would be swept along. I realized then that if I continued to rely on goodwill, I would keep losing ground quietly. Not because anyone hated me, but because no one was incentivized to slow down for me. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply opened my notebook, the one I'd carried with me out of habit, and began writing. I wrote down what was missing. I wrote down dates. I wrote down what had been discussed and what had not. I wrote down how decisions were being framed. It felt less like preparing for a conflict and more like reclaiming my own narrative. As I sat there, I thought about all the times I'd been told, implicitly, that my calmness was a gift to others, that my ability to adapt made things easier. I had never considered that calmness could also be a tool for me. Silence, I realized, didn't have to mean absence. It could mean containment. I locked the door when I left and returned the key to my bag, not out of spite, just out of intention. On the drive home, I didn't feel lighter. I felt anchored. That day, nothing changed externally. No emails were sent, no decisions were reversed. No one knew that anything had shifted at all. But internally, I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I stopped waiting for a moment when it would be appropriate to assert myself. I stopped assuming fairness would emerge naturally if I was patient enough. Instead, I committed to something quieter and far more consequential. I would stop volunteering my disadvantage. From that point on, every silence would be deliberate. Every delay is chosen. Every response is measured. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning. And that shift, unseen, unannounced, would shape everything that followed. After that day, I spoke less and listened with intention. On the surface, nothing about my behavior seemed different. I still answered messages. I still acknowledged updates. I still used the same calm tone that everyone was accustomed to. That familiarity became my camouflage. Inside, though, silence had changed its meaning. Before, my quiet had been reactive. I stayed silent to avoid friction, to give others room, to keep things smooth. Now, my silence was selective. I spoke when the information was incomplete. I stayed quiet when people revealed more than they realized. Daniel continued to move forward with confidence. He filled the space my explanations used to occupy with assumptions. When I didn't object immediately, he read it as alignment. That works, he'd say. Or, glad we're on the same page. I didn't correct him. I noticed how often plans were justified by urgency. How quickly we should became we will. How rarely anyone paused to check whether the pace itself was fair. I also noticed how much people reveal when they believe there will be no resistance. In one call, Daniel mentioned, almost in passing, that the agent had suggested doing a clean sweep of the house to make showings easier, clearing out anything that wasn't neutral. He said it like it was a helpful favor. I asked one question, just one. What's your definition of neutral? There was a pause, a small one, enough to tell me the term hadn't been examined very closely. You know, he said, personal stuff. Things buyers don't need to see. I let the silence stretch, not confrontational, just open. Well, he added, filling it, we'll obviously be careful. Obviously. Another word that sounded solid until you looked at it too closely. After the call, I wrote down what had been said. Not because I needed proof yet, but because I wanted continuity. I wanted to see the shape of the process clearly, without emotion blurring it. Others continued to mistake my restraint for compliance. Relatives told me how lucky I was to have a brother taking charge. Friends praised my maturity. No one asked whether I had agreed to the terms under which that charge was being taken. I started receiving fewer questions and more notifications, fewer invitations to weigh in, more updates after the fact. My role was stabilizing itself into exactly what I had recognized earlier, and I let it. Because something else was happening alongside it. I was learning the language of the process, legal phrasing, timelines, obligations. I revisited the estate documents our parents had left, not in a rush, slowly, carefully, without assumption. I noticed details that hadn't been mentioned in the conversation, clauses that required consent, procedures that couldn't be bypassed by momentum alone. My silence created space for observation. Observation created leverage, not in the dramatic sense, but in the structural one. At one point, Daniel asked if everything was okay with me. His tone was casual, almost benevolent. "You've been pretty quiet," he said. I smiled to myself before answering. "I'm just processing," I replied. "There's a lot to take in." That was true, just not in the way he assumed. The more I said less, the more others filled in my position for me. They decided I was overwhelmed, or trusting, or disengaged. They did not consider that I might be deliberate. What I didn't do during this time is important. I didn't vent. I didn't rally support. I didn't confront Daniel with accusations. I didn't dramatize my discomfort to force recognition. I let the system reveal itself fully because systems, once exposed, tell you exactly where their weak points are, not through conflict, but through repetition. By choosing silence, I removed friction. And without friction, processes speed up. They become careless, assumptions harden, corners get cut. Everyone else thought they were gaining efficiency. What they were actually doing was leaving a trail. By the time they realized my silence wasn't emptiness, it would be far too late to slow down and correct course. At that stage, though, no one sensed danger. No one felt challenged. The calm remained intact. And that calm, the same one they had always mistaken for my weakness, had become the most strategic position I'd ever occupied. What they never noticed was how methodical I can be when no one is watching. They knew me as careful, yes, but only in the domestic sense. The one who double checked appointments, who remembered where documents were filed, who didn't lose receipts. What they didn't connect was that this same attention, when applied deliberately, becomes something else entirely. It becomes positioning. While Daniel focused on speed, I focused on structure. While he talked in generalities, I returned to specifics. I read everything twice, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Curiosity has a way of revealing what confidence skips over. I pulled up the estate documents again and laid them out in front of me one evening. Not all at once, piece by piece. I wasn't looking for a loophole. I was looking for alignment between what was being said out loud and what was actually required. They didn't always match. I learned which decisions required unanimous consent and which didn't. I learned what constituted personal property versus estate property. I learned how included contents was a phrase of convenience, not legality. Most importantly, I learned that silence doesn't waive rights. That was a pivotal realization. Quiet participation is still participation, but only when it's recognized. Absence of objection is not the same as agreement, no matter how often people treat it that way. I also revisited my own records, not defensively, systematically. I created a simple timeline, and I purchased certain items, where they were placed, and why. I attached receipts where I had them, bank statements where I didn't. I didn't embellish, I didn't argue, I documented. Each entry felt grounded, not empowering in a dramatic sense, stabilizing, like placing weight evenly across a surface. Meanwhile, the process around me accelerated. Daniel sent updates about staging being scheduled, about photos being taken, about early interest. He spoke in terms of momentum, as if stopping to reassess would somehow undo progress already made. I responded politely. I asked logistical questions that didn't reveal my internal shift. Where would items be stored temporarily? Who would have access? What dates were confirmed? He answered easily, sometimes too easily. He forwarded emails without removing comments, shared documents with default permissions. He assumed I was passive, not attentive. That assumption worked in my favor. I began to see patterns in how decisions were justified. Financial efficiency was always the headline. Emotional considerations were treated as footnotes. Personal belongings were collapsed into categories that suited the pace of sale. What struck me most was how much trust was being placed in the idea that everything could be sorted out later. Later is a dangerous word. It postpones accountability. It invites forgetting. So I made sure nothing was forgotten. I didn't interfere with the process. I let staging happen. I let listings progress. I let conversations continue without interruption. Each step forward clarified the boundaries of what was being assumed and by whom. At one point, Daniel mentioned that it might be easier if I just came by after everything settles to collect what I wanted. I nodded verbally. I didn't correct him, because by then, I understood something essential. Once a process is in motion, stopping it requires force, but redirecting it requires timing. And timing favors those who prepare quietly. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing for inevitability, for the moment when assumptions would collide with documentation, when speed would run into structure. I also paid attention to my own emotional state. That mattered more than I expected. I made sure I wasn't acting out of hurt or resentment. I checked myself often. If I felt reactive, I paused. If something felt urgent, I waited. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about restoring proportion. The house, the belongings, the decisions, they weren't just assets. They were symbols of how easily someone's contributions can be erased when they don't demand recognition. I wasn't interested in reclaiming space loudly. I was interested in reclaiming it cleanly. By the end of that period, I had everything I needed, not to strike, but to stand. They still saw me as compliant, as grieving, as removed from the mechanics of what was happening. They never noticed that while they were busy moving things forward, I was anchoring myself in place. And once anchored, movement, when it comes, is impossible to ignore. The reveal didn't arrive with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and smiled, no sense of triumph or vindication. What I felt instead was a deep, almost sobering clarity. It happened late one evening, after I'd reread the estate documents for what felt like the 10th time. Not because I expected something new to appear, but because repetition has a way of sharpening focus. Each pass strips away assumption and leaves only what's actually there. That night, I noticed a pattern I hadn't fully appreciated before. Several of the actions already in motion, the staging, the early negotiations, the treatment of certain contents as included, were being justified socially, not legally. They relied on momentum, on the idea that everyone was aligned, on the unspoken belief that I wouldn't object in any meaningful way. But alignment isn't implied, it's documented. There it was, in clear language. Decisions affecting jointly held property required explicit consent, not a notification, not silence, consent. And personal property, items purchased independently and not gifted, did not become part of the estate simply because they were located in the house. None of this was hidden. It wasn't clever. It was simply overlooked because no one expected it to matter. I closed the document and sat quietly for a long time. What I had wasn't a weapon, it was footing. I thought back to the missing box of letters, to the casual way items were being categorized and moved. I thought about the language Daniel used: clean sweep, included contents. We'll sort it out later. None of it was malicious. It was just careless. Careless in a way that assumed my cooperation indefinitely. The realization settled in slowly. The process depended on my continued passivity to remain smooth. Without it, timelines would have to be revisited. Agreements would need clarification. Certain actions would require a pause. I wasn't discovering power over someone else. I was rediscovering my own position in the structure. That distinction mattered. I didn't feel excited. I felt responsible. Because once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. You're accountable for what you do with that clarity. I reviewed my notes again. Dates, communications, the exact wording used in emails. I didn't interpret. I just aligned facts with requirements. Everything I documented supported the same conclusion. Nothing irreversible had happened yet. But only because I hadn't allowed it to be. That was the leverage, not a threat, a boundary. I also realized something else, quieter, but just as important. If I acted too early, emotionally, defensively, I would be dismissed. If I acted too late, I would be absorbed. The window was narrow, and timing would matter more than force. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not Daniel, not relatives, not friends. There was no need. Reveals don't need audiences to be real. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the funeral. Not because everything was resolved, but because it was grounded. I knew where I stood. I knew what could and couldn't happen without me. The next morning, Daniel sent another update. The tone was upbeat, optimistic. He mentioned interest from a buyer and how things were moving faster than expected. I read the message carefully. Then I replied with a single sentence. Thanks for the update. Let's make sure we pause before anything becomes binding. No explanation, no accusation, just a reminder. He responded with a thumbs up emoji. I understood then how invisible the shift still was to him. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a flaw in someone else. It was about discovering the exact point where my silence could end, cleanly, precisely, without drama, and knowing that when it did, the story would change shape in a way no one could dismiss as emotional or impulsive. Only factual, only necessary, only final. Once clarity settles in, it brings something with it that's heavier than anger. Choice. Until that point, I could still tell myself I was reacting, that I was adjusting to circumstances, shaped by someone else's momentum. But now, with the structure visible and my position within it defined, I couldn't pretend neutrality anymore. I had options. I could confront Daniel directly, lay everything out, show him what I'd found, insist on a reset. It would be clean in theory, honest. It would also rely on his willingness to slow down, to acknowledge missteps, to shift a process already underway. I could appeal to family, frame it as a misunderstanding, ask for mediation, risk having my concerns diluted, reframed as emotional reactions to grief, risk being told again to be flexible. Or I could do nothing, let the process continue, and hope that goodwill would eventually correct itself. Accept the quiet losses as the cost of peace. Each option came with consequences. None of them was neutral. I spent several days sitting with those possibilities. I didn't rush. I wanted to be certain that whatever I chose would align with something deeper than irritation or pride. What surprised me was how little resentment I felt. I wasn't trying to punish Daniel. I wasn't interested in proving him wrong. What I wanted was proportion, an outcome that matched reality, not assumption. That narrowed my choices quickly. Confrontation, I realized, would center the story on emotion, on intentions, on who meant what. It would invite negotiation around my discomfort instead of acknowledgement of my rights. Silence, on the other hand, would allow the imbalance to harden into permanence. So I chose a third path, one that didn't ask for permission or validation. I decided to act within the structure, formally, quietly, and in a way that couldn't be undone by persuasion or urgency. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel bold. It felt precise. I contacted an estate attorney, not to escalate, but to confirm. I framed everything neutrally. I asked questions about process, not people, about timing, not blame. The answers were exactly what I expected. Certain actions required my explicit consent. Certain assumptions were just that, assumptions. And once certain steps were taken without proper alignment, they would have to be revisited, no matter how inconvenient that was. The attorney didn't sound alarmed, or impressed, or judgmental. He sounded factual. That was when I knew I'd made the right choice. Because facts don't argue, they don't explain themselves, they simply stand. I didn't inform Daniel of this step. Not yet. I didn't need to. The decision wasn't about signaling intent, it was about positioning myself so that when the moment came, I wouldn't need to convince anyone of anything. I reviewed my notes one last time and organized them, not as evidence against someone, but as a record of reality. That night, I felt a strange calm, not relief, resolution. The decision I'd made was irreversible, not because it burned bridges, but because it restored boundaries that couldn't be unlearned. I was no longer operating on trust alone. I was operating on clarity. The next phase would involve action, yes, but not confrontation, not yet. Just alignment between what was happening and what was allowed to happen. That was all, and it would be enough. The days that followed were outwardly uneventful. That was intentional. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't alter my tone. I didn't suddenly become more assertive in conversation. I let everything look exactly as it had before. Silence at this stage wasn't about withholding information. It was about sequencing. I began by doing only what was necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. Through the attorney, I requested formal copies of all documents related to the estate process as it currently stood. Not revisions, not drafts, the versions that had been acted upon. That distinction mattered. I also requested clarification, written clarification, on which decisions had been made with my explicit consent and which had not. The answers came back slowly, not because anyone was being obstructive, but because the question itself disrupted the assumed flow. It introduced a pause where there hadn't been one before. I let that pause exist. At the same time, I separated my personal property on paper. Not physically yet, just formally. I listed items I had purchased, their approximate dates, and their current location. I didn't accuse anyone of misappropriation. I simply established ownership. It was astonishing how much weight that carried once it was written down. I didn't send this list to Daniel. I didn't copy him. I wasn't making a statement. I was preparing a foundation. Daniel continued sending updates, unaware that the ground beneath the process was quietly being reinforced. One email mentioned that movers would likely be scheduled soon to clear out remaining items before final staging. I read that sentence twice. Soon is vague enough to feel harmless. It's also where assumptions live. I replied with a neutral acknowledgement and nothing else. Then, separately, I asked the attorney a simple question. What happens if personal property is moved or sold without the owner's consent? The answer was concise. It shouldn't happen. And if it does, the process stops until it's resolved. I didn't feel satisfied reading that. I felt confirmation. From that point on, every step I took was preventative, not reactive. I arranged time off work, not because I knew something would happen, but because I suspected it might. I ensured my records were accessible. I kept my phone close. Still, I said nothing. To anyone watching, I was still the calm sister, the one who wasn't complicating things, the one who trusted the process. Daniel even commented on it once. I appreciate you not making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I thanked him. That gratitude, misplaced as it was, told me everything I needed to know. Because ease in his mind was measured by the absence of resistance, not by the presence of fairness. The system was still running on the assumption that I wouldn't intervene. That assumption allowed it to move faster and faster, skipping checks that would have been inconvenient to revisit. What no one realized was that the moment it crossed from assumption into action, irreversible action, was the moment the silence would end. Until then, I let things proceed. Not because I was powerless, because I was prepared. The call came early in the morning, not from Daniel, from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail, not out of avoidance, but habit. I was making coffee, letting the day start at its own pace. The message was brief and professional. Hi, this is Mark from Evergreen Moving. We're at the Carter residence for the scheduled pickup. Just confirming access. Scheduled pickup. I listened to the message twice, slowly. Daniel hadn't mentioned a confirmed date. He'd said soon. Vague, harmless, convenient. I didn't call back immediately. Instead, I opened my notebook, checked the timeline, cross-referenced emails. The mention of movers had been framed as a future possibility, not a finalized action. No consent, no confirmation. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the moment. Then I got in my car. When I arrived at the house, the street looked different. There was a large truck parked out front. The back doors were open. Two movers were already inside, carrying items out with practiced efficiency. My furniture, the sofa, the dining chairs, the sideboard I'd refinished myself years earlier. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching, not frozen, observant. This was the moment assumptions became action. I walked up calmly and introduced myself to the foreman. I asked who had authorized the move. He checked his clipboard and gave Daniel's name. Which items are being removed today? I asked. All contents listed, he replied, gesturing vaguely. House is being cleared for staging. I stepped inside. The living room felt hollowed out. Not empty yet, but in motion. As if my presence was incidental to the process. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of theft. I simply said, some of these items are personal property and cannot be moved. The foreman hesitated, not argumentative, uncertain. Can you show me which ones? He asked. I did. I named them clearly, precisely, without emotion. The sofa, the dining set, the guest bed, the sideboard. He nodded slowly. I'll need to pause and confirm, he said. I thanked him. That pause, the first real one in weeks, rippled outward immediately. The movers stopped. One of them checked his phone. Another stepped outside to make a call. I stood in the doorway, not blocking anything, just present. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. His expression wasn't angry. It was confused. What's going on? He asked, glancing between me and the truck. I explained calmly that the personal property I had purchased was being moved without my consent, and that the process needed to pause until ownership was clarified. He frowned. This is just staging, he said. We talked about this. No, I replied evenly. We talked about timelines, not authorization. The difference landed harder than I expected. I could see it in his face. Not outrage, but recalibration. The sudden realization that the ground wasn't as solid as he'd assumed. This is really not the time, he said quietly. The movers are here. That's why it's the time, I answered. I didn't say more. The foreman returned and said they'd need written confirmation before proceeding with any disputed items. Policy, not preference. Daniel stepped aside to make a call. I stayed where I was. Neighbors watched from a distance. The truck stayed open. The house, mid-transition, hovered in a kind of limbo. For the first time since the funeral, something had slowed down. Not because of emotion, but because of structure. The consequences didn't announce themselves dramatically. They showed up as an inconvenience, delay, uncertainty. Daniel returned and said, we'd figure it out, his voice tighter now. He looked at me differently, not with anger, but with a dawning awareness that I wasn't where he'd left me. The movers packed up what they'd already removed back inside. The truck doors closed. No one yelled. No one won. But something had shifted irrevocably. From that moment on, nothing could proceed without accounting for me, not as a courtesy, but as a requirement. And the loss they felt, the disruption, the delay, the embarrassment, wasn't something they could name clearly yet. They just knew that something smooth had broken, and they didn't understand why. After that morning, the tone of everything changed. Not openly, not all at once, but beneath every interaction, there was a new current, one made of urgency instead of confidence. Daniel started calling more often. At first, his voice was careful, almost conciliatory. He framed conversations as check-ins, as if we were simply aligning after a small misunderstanding. He used phrases like getting back on track and smoothing things out, as though what had happened was a brief technical hiccup rather than a structural interruption. I listened, I didn't correct his framing because what he didn't understand yet was that the track he wanted to return to no longer existed. The agent called next. Polite, professional, slightly strained. She asked if there were any other concerns that might affect the timeline. Her choice of words revealed a quiet anxiety, the kind professionals develop when a process they rely on stops behaving predictably. I told her there were clarifications still in progress regarding ownership and consent. Clarifications, no conflicts. She thanked me and said they would hold off on further arrangements. Holding off costs money, time, momentum. That's when the panic began. Not emotional panic, but logistical panic. Schedules had to be revised, buyers had to be updated, vendors had to be rescheduled. All the things that had been rushed under the assumption of my passivity now had to be revisited under the reality of my presence. Daniel grew restless. He asked why I hadn't raised these concerns earlier. I told him calmly that I had asked questions and requested time, and that silence was not agreement. He said, "You could have just said something." I looked at him and replied, "I did, just not loudly." That answer frustrated him more than anger would have, because frustration implies ambiguity, something that can still be negotiated. What he was facing now was clarity, and clarity leaves very little room for reinterpretation. He tried reason next. He talked about efficiency, about stress, about how everyone was dealing with loss. I agreed with him, and then I repeated the boundary. Some items were mine. Some decisions required my consent. Until those were addressed properly, the process would remain paused. There was no heat in my voice, no accusation, no threat. That was what made it impossible to fix, because there was nothing to soothe, nothing to placate, nothing to argue against. Only facts that had been ignored for too long. The family started to notice. An aunt called to ask why things were delayed. A cousin suggested we were all just tired and needed to be flexible. Flexible? For whom? I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain the whole story. I simply said that certain steps needed to be handled correctly before moving forward. The phrase spread quietly, handled correctly. It carried weight. Daniel realized, slowly and painfully, that the issue wasn't that I was upset. It was that the system he'd built depended on my invisibility. And once that invisibility disappeared, the system couldn't function as designed. He asked finally if we could go back to how it was. That was the moment I knew it was too late. Not because I wanted punishment, but because how it was had only worked by excluding me. And exclusion, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. I told him we could move forward, but not backward. That distinction landed heavily. There were long pauses in conversation now, unfinished sentences, messages left on read while people recalibrated their language. The house sat half staged, half lived in, neither ready for sale nor comfortably occupied. A physical manifestation of the process itself, caught between assumption and reality. Everyone wanted a resolution, quick resolution. What they were slowly understanding was that speed had been the problem. By the time they accepted that, the window for easy correction had closed. Not because I had slammed it shut, but because it had never truly been open to begin with. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no rehearsed speech, no moment where I listed grievances or demanded apologies. It happened on a quiet afternoon, in the same living room where so much had already shifted. Daniel and I sat across from each other at the bare dining table. The chairs were mismatched now, some removed, some returned hastily after the movers left. The imbalance felt symbolic. He spoke first. I didn't realize this mattered to you so much, he said. I let the sentence sit. Not because I was searching for words, but because it needed to be examined. It always mattered, I replied. I just didn't make it loud. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing that for the first time. I thought you trusted me, he said. I trusted the process would include me, I answered. Those aren't the same thing. That was the core of it. Not betrayal, not malice, misalignment. He asked why I hadn't pushed harder earlier. Why hadn't insisted? Why I wait until things were already complicated? I told him the truth. Because when I explained things before, they were treated as optional. I needed them to be treated as real. There was a long pause after that. He looked tired, not angry, not defensive, just exposed. As if the confidence he'd carried had finally reached its limit. I wasn't trying to cut you out, he said quietly. I know, I replied, and I meant it. But intent doesn't replace impact, I added. And speed doesn't replace consent. That was the closest thing to a line I delivered. Veer. We talked through specifics after that. Slowly. Item by item. Decision by decision. Not arguing, clarifying. The conversation felt procedural, almost formal, which was exactly what it needed to be. I didn't accuse him of wrongdoing. I didn't recount every moment of dismissal. I focused on what needed to change for us to move forward. Consent would be explicit. Ownership would be respected. Timelines would be agreed upon, not assumed. He agreed, not enthusiastically, but clearly. The absence of emotional heat made it impossible for him to dismiss the conversation as grief or overreaction. There was nothing to diffuse, only terms to accept. At one point, he asked, Are you angry with me? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I'm just not invisible anymore. He absorbed that in silence. When we stood to leave, nothing felt resolved emotionally. There were no hugs, no declarations of understanding. But something more important had happened. The structure had shifted. From that point on, conversations included me by default. Not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. My questions were answered directly. My boundaries were noted. Not because Daniel had suddenly changed as a person, but because the system now required it. As I walked out of the house that day, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. There's a particular kind of peace that comes not from being validated, but from being correctly placed. That was what the confrontation gave me, not closure, position. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, but it doesn't erase what you learn when those edges first appear. Months after everything settled, after the house was finally sold, after belongings were sorted properly, after conversations became quieter and more precise, I noticed something subtle but lasting had changed in me. Not my temperament, my position. I was still calm, still observant, still someone who preferred clarity over noise. But I was no longer confusing calmness with accommodation. Before all of this, I thought being reasonable meant being flexible. If I could see multiple sides, it was my responsibility to yield first. I understand now that reasonableness without boundaries isn't generosity, it's erasure. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. Daniel and I speak differently now. Less frequently, perhaps, but more accurately. There's a mutual awareness in our conversations that didn't exist before. A recognition that assumptions carry weight and that silence isn't empty. We never revisited the conflict emotionally. We didn't need to. The lesson embedded itself into how things are done now. Decisions are named, roles are clarified. I'm asked, not informed. That shift didn't require constant enforcement. It required one moment of undeniable alignment. What stayed with me most wasn't the legal process or the logistics. It was the realization that I had spent years earning trust without ever cashing it in. I had built reliability into my identity so thoroughly that people forgot it came with agency. Now, when I choose to help, it's visible. When I choose to stay quiet, it's intentional. When I say yes, it's because no would also have been acceptable. That internal recalibration changed how I move through the world, not just in my family, but everywhere else too. At work, I no longer preemptively solve problems without being invited into the decision making. I ask where my role begins and ends. I don't fill gaps automatically. I let responsibility sit where it belongs. In friendships, I no longer assume understanding without articulation. I state needs early, calmly, without apology. The people who respect that stay close. The ones who benefited from my invisibility drift away. There's no bitterness in that, just sorting. I still carry the leather bound notebook, not because I expect conflict, but because it reminds me of who I am when things go quiet. Observant, grounded, prepared. The house is gone now. So are many of the objects that once anchored it. But what remains feels more permanent than furniture or walls. I know where I stand. I know that my value isn't in how easy I make things for others, but in how accurately I represent myself within them. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about control. It's about refusal. The refusal to disappear for the sake of convenience. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't rewrite the past. I simply stepped into my own outline and stayed there. And that, it turns out, was enough. When I look back on everything now, what stands out isn't the house or the paperwork or even the moment I arrived and found movers loading furniture I had paid for. Those are events. What stayed with me was the realization that harm doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives dressed as efficiency. Sometimes it calls itself taking care of things. Sometimes it happens because no one expects you to object. For a long time, I believed that being calm was the same as being safe. That if I didn't challenge people, they wouldn't challenge me. But calmness, when it isn't paired with boundaries, becomes an invitation for others to decide where you end. My brother sold our parents' house the morning after the funeral, not because he was cruel, but because he believed speed was synonymous with responsibility. I arrived to collect photos and found movers loading furniture I paid for, not because anyone wanted to hurt me, but because no one had been trained to slow down for me. That's the uncomfortable truth. Most injustice doesn't come from villains. It comes from systems that reward confidence and overlook quiet contribution, from families that confuse reliability with availability, from people who mistake your silence for surrender. What changed my life wasn't confrontation, it was alignment. The moment I stopped explaining my worth and started structuring it, everything recalibrated. Not instantly, not painlessly, but permanently. I didn't need to humiliate anyone. I didn't need to win an argument. I didn't even need to be fully understood. I needed to be unmistakably present. If there's a moral here, it's this: you don't owe anyone your invisibility. Being kind doesn't require being small. Being calm doesn't require being passive. And being quiet doesn't mean you don't get a say. If you're someone who's always been the reasonable one, the one who absorbs discomfort so others don't have to, I hope this story gives you something: not courage to fight, but permission to stand. Standing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like silence that finally has weight behind it. And sometimes it looks like arriving at a house you helped hold together and deciding, calmly, that you will no longer be treated as a guest in your own life. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely love to read your answer in the comments. When was the moment you realized your silence was being mistaken for consent? And what did you do next?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ